Okay, good. This is going to be a very interactive session. And so we're going to invite audience participation from the very beginning. We're waiting for two of our panelists to show up. Will they show up? Can we turn off that slide at some point? Tech people? Hello? Oh, thank you. Is that okay if you have to can you turn the lights up somehow? Because we're not making presentations. We'll talk, but we want to talk with you. It would be possible, yeah. So let me start off with a question as a way of making sure we understand what we want to talk about in the next 45 minutes. I used the word in my, how many people heard my presentation? Everybody else? No. I use the word scale up and scaling up a lot. I'd like you to just think of one word. This is, the microphone is for you, not for them. Okay. So I'd like to ask you to think of just one word that comes to mind when you hear the term, the phrase, scale up or scaling up. What does it connote to you? What does it convey to you? What is it, just think for a second. What emotion, what color, what adverb or adjective, and you can't say growth because that's too easy. What is? Yes. Where are the lights, by the way? Okay. Got it. One time I was in your position, Christine, and the lights were going on and off, and I found out that I was leaning on the lights. That's the reason I was asking. That's much better. So, what word, what phrase, what emotion does that conjure up in your mind? And let's be as creative as possible. I'll just jot some of these down. Oh, wow. So it's like excitement. But if you've taken steroids, you also know that it's possible that it leads to anger and roid rage. I saw a hand there. Yes. Sustainability. I'll just ask you to speak up. Now I'm going to give you. You did that on purpose, so I give you more airtime because you have to explain what you meant. Interesting. Conversion of light into energy, into growth. Yes. Sorry? Stretching. Doing more than you thought possible. And the woman right behind you? So there's pains, growing pains. What other, because it's interesting, there's kind of an ambivalence here. There's steroids, of course, that sounds like a good fast thing, but there's a negative part to it. The stretching, that can hurt. It can also be a good thing. Growing pains, the growing part is good. So scaling up influences more scaling up. It's the gift that keeps giving. Let's get a couple more. Yes. Overwhelming. More ambivalence. Sounds like it's something that's hard to do. Efficiency. Just could you explain that? Explain that. Okay. So there's efficiency is easier. So some get harder and some get easier. Let's get a couple more. What are we really missing? Woman back there. Sorry? Competiting? Capacity. I'm sorry. I don't hear very well out of my left ear. Capacity. These are great.
Management challenges.
I'll just write down challenges because they may be more than management. Let's give you another.
Sky is the limit.
So I'm gonna. Can I say limitless?
Limitless.
Okay. Yes. Systems and processes. Let's get one more. What are we missing? Something that you gotta. Yes. Profit. Thank you. Profit with an F, I assume. So, although maybe with a little bit of a PH as well.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to respond quickly, and then I'll let Eric introduce themselves. We're going to start off having a little conversation between us, and but I really hope that it'll broaden and engage everybody. Would you mind just shutting the door because there's a lot of noise out there? I can really resonate to the dual nature of some of the words that you use. Some of it conveys excitement and opportunity, those are words you used, and some of the words convey difficulty and challenge and obstacles. And I think both of them are relevant in the process of scaling up, whether it's scaling as individual companies or scaling as regions. I want to focus more in this conversation on the regional scale up. At 3 o'clock, I do a master class on how individual entrepreneurs can grow their companies better and faster. But I'd rather really focus on the regional, the more systemic aspects of scaling up. I didn't invent the term. That may be obvious, but I did not invent the term scale up. When I heard it the first time, a colleague of mine applied it to our project called Scale Up Milwaukee. And it immediately struck me as a very important metaphor or phrase. Because I have felt for a long time that those of us who promote entrepreneurship, invest, act as entrepreneurs, heavily overemphasize the aspect of scaling up that is starting up. The analogy of having a baby, I think, is apt. And my apologies to the mothers here, but I've been involved, I should say, in having 4 babies. The pain was the mother's. But even with all the pain, it's orders of magnitude easier to have a baby than to grow a family. Having the baby, it sort of happens, it's short, it's discreet, but growing it into something important, that's where the benefits come. If you stop at having the baby at the startup, no benefits accrue, except for maybe a lot of fun like having a baby, or starting one, but no benefits accrue to anyone else unless it grows, unless the family grows. And it's those benefits, the wealth, the taxes, the jobs, the quality of life, that's what we've been focusing on. I think that only companies that grow can really generate those benefits for a region. And it turns out, all around the world, that as much as we can measure, the more companies that grow in a given region, the fewer of them actually start. In other words, there's a perfectly strong negative correlation. This is empirical. I didn't bore you this morning with all the graphs that I have. I hid them all. There's a strong negative correlation in all the Kaufman data, in all the GEM data, in all the World Economic Forum data. A strong negative correlation between what they measure as the amount of entrepreneurial activity in a region, meaning startups, and whether it's competitiveness or growth or prosperity or any other measure that we have. And I know that'll shock you because one of the mantras that you've heard from people like me and from this organization and that you've probably told each other is that startups are the engines of growth, and they're not. The evidence is that they're not. Having a small number of high-quality startups is completely different from having a large quantity of newly registered firms. It's a completely different beast. So that's enough for me right now. We created a 3-day open enrollment program for people from all over the world. One of the to help them start their own scale-up projects. It's called Driving Economic Growth. I do it with Babson. And one of the people who appeared on our doorstep was Eric Hansen. Eric, briefly introduce yourself. Maybe I'll even interview a little bit about what you're doing with Scale Up in Russia.
Absolutely. Yeah, my name is Eric Hansen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship in Russia. And we're a 15-year-old organization to help accelerate the growth of entrepreneurship in Russia. And the past few years, probably starting 5 years ago, we decided to help. After I met Dan in Mexico City at a conference, and he talked about economic ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems, we started working probably that year in developing entrepreneurial ecosystems in cities. I'm an entrepreneurship center in Russia. I'm sorry, yeah. And I'm an entrepreneurship center, and we conduct trainings and conferences and stuff for entrepreneurs. And so basically what we did is we sort of took a shotgun approach. We went out and did feelers in multiple cities to see who the strong leaders were and stuff, and let them be hosts of GW. We had Fast Track, we put it on, and for a couple 3 years we were doing this, never really getting anywhere. The ecosystem wasn't really seeming to develop. Yeah, there were some more trained entrepreneurs, but the connections weren't really rich or strong or growing. And a couple of years ago, Dan, it was 2 for me. It was 2 years ago. But you started 3 years ago with your open enrollment seminar. I attended his seminar at Babson. And, again, he talked about the ecosystem like he did this morning, but he gave sort of a roadmap on what types of programs help better. And one was the Scale Accelerator, the Scalerator, as it's called in some cities. And after that, I said, wow, I mean, we could really do, a more targeted scale-up program and have as sort of our main pillar a scale-up accelerator for growth entrepreneurs. And so we spent a year developing it using methodology that we had, training programs that we had, and we've now developed and launched last year a 9-month Scalerator program for high potential entrepreneurs who want to get to another level of growth. And it consists of 40 hours of formal training in 10 different subjects, and entrepreneurs do the training. We immediately, like Dan said upstairs, that it needs to be sustainable and we need to have an exit strategy. And I heard that a couple of years ago too. So the first thing we do is we train entrepreneurs who then train our modules. We also have 4 networking events that are open to the whole community that talk about vital questions about growth. And then we have a 9-month mentoring program based upon but it's based upon the YBI program, the Youth Business International program out of London that's in 40, 50 countries. And so we sort of get, wide-scale networking, group networking and knowledge through the seminars, and then the one-on-one with mentoring. So we have from one-on-one to community-wide. And it's open for the whole community.
So there's now already in 5 cities.
In 5 cities.
And 3 more coming online.
3 more coming online.
So give us an example of some of those cities, because Moscow isn't one of them, right?
No, Moscow, St. Petersburg are not one of them. We're focusing on cities from 500,000 to 1 million. In Moscow, it's a very hub and spoke system, or in Russia, it's a hub and spoke system, that all the funding, everything goes to Moscow, and Moscow sends it back out. Well, not a lot goes back out. And so there's a lot of depressed areas in Russia. There's a lot of high movement in Russia. I think Manizales might be an example where people come, maybe study there, then go to Bogota or someplace else. And there's a lot of outflow from mid-sized cities in Russia going to either Moscow or St. Petersburg. So we focused on those cities to try to keep people in those cities and growing their businesses.
How will you know if it's successful? When and how?
Well, I hope by the end of 2018, after our 3rd year doing the actual Scale Up Accelerator as part of this economic development program, we'll start to see results in terms of sustainability. Because right now, our center is, we're an LLC, so we conduct events and we make money.
LLC is limited
For-profit.
liability company,
Yes.
for profit.
Yeah. And so, we get some grants from other organizations and stuff. City Foundation has given us a grant in the past, but a lot of this we're self-funding through revenues from other streams because, in the future, we'd like to sell this to cities. So we're using these 5 to 8 cities as sort of hopefully success stories. If a couple of them, in a year, we're going to start, after we go through 2 years with them, we're going to start asking for a little bit more financing from them. And I think we'll see if there's success, if out of these 8 cities or so, if, 3, 2, 3, 4, finds enough value that it becomes self-financing on their own, that the regional development organizations finance our local partner. And then what we'll do is we'll transition to a party licensing agreement where they can use the brand, the programming, updates, et cetera.
So I want to reiterate a point that I made. By the way, feel free to make comments, and I'll be looking for hands or people moving in their seats. But one of the comments that I made in my talk this morning was that the different stakeholders have different objectives. Fortunately, more companies growing more rapidly in the region helps a lot of them achieve a lot of their objectives better. So one of your customers are people who think in terms of economic development. For them, that's what's important. And whatever metrics they use, if they think, rightly or wrongly, that you are helping them develop those metrics, increase those metrics, you'll get funding. So in a way, that's a kind of like an acid test.
And actually what we did, when I left Dan's program, the first thing I did when I had sort of a vision on expanding our programs and introducing this scale accelerator pillar into our communities where we work, was that I hired a results tracking consultant who sat down with me, and I said, I want, before we even develop our program, the Scalerator program for these cities, I want to be able to track certain metrics. I need it for myself, for my success, but I want the communities, our partners with whom we work, to be able to, from day one, understand what metrics we're trying to achieve. And that's company growth, that's number of new employees, number of different participants in the ecosystem that participate in the various programs. So we went from day one, even before we started outlining what this could look like, I hired a consultant to say, this is what I want to achieve, and I want to start tracking it from pre-inception.
So one of the measures that we've never taken so far, but we're starting to, came out of a visit to Scale Up Milwaukee, to the Scalerator of Scale Up Milwaukee, by the lieutenant governor. So in the U.S., there's a second, like a deputy governor who's also elected, Rebecca Clayfish in this case. And every time she came, she would ask, and she's a great supporter because she sees the growth happening, and she asked for a show of hands, how many of you paid taxes this year? And all of the companies raised their hands, and she said, that is music to my ears. You warm my heart. Now, a lot of us think that taxes are the enemy, but the truth of the matter is that if for some of the stakeholders, taxes are important. And so we have never done this, but we're now starting to count the taxes that the companies are actually paying and how those are increasing. Now, you can't use that metric or KPI to go to a bank and say, support Scale Up. What you can do to go to a bank is a different metric. How the default rates, the repayment rates, the profits you've made from the loans to the companies, the number of new financings, et cetera. For the educators, it turns out, and this is something I learned from Manizales Mas, there are 5 universities who are putting a little bit of funding into Manizales Mas. There are 15 funders together who set the policy of Manizales Mas. It's a real headache, but it pays off in commitment. 5 of them are universities. It turns out that one of the things that's on the university's minds is the fact that they have to be accredited every 5 years. So probably in your countries as well, you can't give it, as a university, you can't give a degree. I can't say you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD unless I've been accredited by the Ministry of Education or some other organization to grant that degree. Turns out that in Colombia, one of the criteria for accrediting or renewing the accreditation of universities is their involvement in the community, in their own communities. So now, as part of Manizales Mas, systematically, the project team in Manizales Mas creates a document, a one-page document for each of the universities, counting how many events did you sponsor, how many of your students participated, how many of your professors taught, how many visitors of entrepreneurs came to your classes, how many new classes do you have? And these all become a page in the accreditation proposal that the universities make. Are the universities more engaged? You better believe that they're more engaged. There's only so much distance you can get out of asking big corporations, as we heard today, which I think was a mistake. Corporations should help entrepreneurs. That isn't sticky. Corporations, what keeps the executives of big companies awake is their competitiveness. If you can help them be more competitive, they will invest in whatever activity that you're engaged in. And competitiveness means a lot of different things. So, for example, we created what looks like a mentoring program in Scale Up Milwaukee, in which the CEOs send their executives to help the growing companies, the scalator companies. But they're not measured on how much they help the companies. They're measured on the kinds of executive development experiences they have while doing it. That's sticky. It's the difference between donating blood, and if I say you should, and you should, it's a good thing. It's a social good to have blood banks. It helps society. But if I tell you to donate blood, you will be slower and do it less frequently than if I tell you you have to get diagnosed for a particular infectious disease. If your doctor says you have to give blood in order to be diagnosed, you better believe that you're going to go donate blood right away. That's sticky. The donating blood model only works so far. It only takes you so far. So one of the tricks of the scale-up movements, and this is the difference between a farm and an ecosystem, one of the tricks of really generating an ecosystem is to make sure that the ecosystem actors benefit in terms that are meaningful, not for you, for them. And then they will invest in growth. When the banks hear about growth and see the possibility of deploying their capital, they will come and support your scale-up program, etc.
I've got an example of that.
But I
too.
want to see more comments and questions.
Yeah,
and debate.
Yeah, one example. We started our Scale Up Accelerator within our, economic, ecosystem development program in these 5 cities last year, and we already have a major Russian bank who's financially supporting us because they see those benefits. One of our cities is similar to Manizales. It's a university town. 500,000 people, 100,000 are students. And, we train professors in how to teach entrepreneurship, methodology, how to train, students, how to develop courses, curriculum development, etc. And that city, Tomsk, actually invited us in, and they're paying for us to come in to train 25 professors in their city because they understand that it's important to, to have their faculty members understand why we teach entrepreneurship, how to do it, etc.
Has anybody here heard of Tomsk before? Be honest. Has anyone heard of Tomsk? 3 people. Anybody before today heard of Manizales? The purpose of these projects is to have an impact, at least our purpose, is to have an impact on normal places. Normal places means that have normal problems. Problems with infrastructure, problems with governance, problems with unemployment, problems with maybe crime or security. These are normal places. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Does he need to have the microphone? So,
Hello. What are the?
tell us
Well, my name is Alvin Cook. I come from the U.S., from the great state of California. Um, so I'm a recent entrepreneur there, and I'm also academic, and I do research, and I also commit to supporting entrepreneurial ecosystems locally and globally. So my question is, what are your best practices for having a better understanding as to how to facilitate the most important stakeholders as you evolve your ecosystem?
And I would assume that the most important stakeholders are the entrepreneurs themselves, right? I mean, I would.
That
Well, I mean, we deal with multiple stakeholders. I mean, we deal with a strong partner and leadership team in each city, and they're made up of multiple stakeholders. You know, there's one sort of leader. Sometimes they're entrepreneurs, sometimes they run entrepreneur organizations like mine, but they're strong. They have extensive networks within that city already. You know, for them, we provide programming, opportunities to bring people together, opportunities to potentially earn money by selling tickets and stuff. So that's how we solve them. Entrepreneurs themselves, I mean, they benefit from the networking. They benefit from going through the Scale Accelerator. They benefit, hopefully, from growing their business. And then, you know, Dan talked about this morning all the different ecosystem players and how they benefit. And what Dan said this morning is we try to do that also. I mean, from day one, we've talked about communicating locally, you know, who's growing. And we've actually sent that consultant I talked about at the end of the first cohort to talk with them, interview the mentors, you know, the successful entrepreneurs who are mentors, the entrepreneurs who are trainers, and the people who went through the Scale Accelerator. How did you grow? How did you change, etc.? And so, you know, so we can communicate that, is what I'm saying.
So I want to respond quickly. I'm not sure what best practices means. That's a sore spot with me, because it implies, and you didn't imply this, it implies sort of copy paste, that I can go somewhere and I can learn who does it best, and then I can do what they do where I am. I lived and worked and invested in Israel for 22 years, during which time I experienced, right in this room, I saw what's called now the startup nation in formation. I saw it at the beginning, I saw it in the middle, I saw it as it took off. And a friend of mine was an advisor to the president of Korea, and he said, I'm meeting with him the next day. This was quite a few years ago, and he read the Startup Nation and wants to know what lessons from Israel are applicable to Korea. And I said, so he called me up, and I said, tell the president the first thing that you should do is get Taiwan and China and Japan and North Korea, that's easy, to declare war on you simultaneously, and then let's have a conversation about what you can do that's relevant, what Israel's done that's relevant. Now, obviously, that was a smart-ass comment. I was being facetious, but my point is, there's almost nothing that you can learn from Silicon Valley and from Berlin and from Boston or from Tel Aviv. There's almost nothing. So this notion of best practices, I think you can learn a lot from sharing practices. So sharing the mentoring programs and sharing the Scalerator programs and showing how engaging the big companies, how it works. What I think is common, but I think there's some commonalities in processes and methodologies. So I think, for example, you don't have to use my map of the ecosystem, but having an understanding that there are different actors in the ecosystem, and if they're not aligned, then you're not going to get fundamental change in the culture. And part of it's about culture change. I'm a social psychologist. My PhD is in social psychology. Don't tell anybody. I have a PhD in psychology. I actually believe that you can change culture very, very quickly in groups and in small societies if you're really focused on what it is you want to change. And we've seen it happen. So number one is that alignment. To get that alignment, you have to be specific. I'm not saying that defining entrepreneurship as growth is the right definition, but it's a definition that is useful. And it's one that people can be aligned around. The banks and the universities and the NGOs can be aligned around the issue of growth. Are there questions? Yes. If you grow really fast, what does that mean about you over here? Are we also taking care of you when you're not growing? So there are a lot of questions. It's not a panacea. So that's number two, is to get aligned around something very specific and be obsessive about it. It's not easy because there's a lot of mythology out there. When you go back home, there's a lot of mythology about what drives growth. It's like the mythology about the world is flat. The world is flat is a pretty good theory for a lot of things, but it's not a good theory for flying an airplane. And so the third thing that I think is a best process is the quick wins. I said it earlier, I called it quickly, demonstrating quick growth. Whatever it is that you do in aligning the stakeholders, if it's abstract and there's nothing they can point to, they can't say, hey, what's your name? What, sorry? Quando, can I just say quando? Is that close enough? Okay, you'll probably mean no, but you're saying yes. Okay, and saying, wow, Quando just got a new contract. We can all point to that. We're bankers, we're university educators, we're the mayor, we're wherever we are. We can say, you know what? That's a good thing. And if we see that happening with her and with you and with you and with you, we can disagree on almost anything. But if we see that happening quickly, that reinforces the alignment. So if there's one thing that I think you have to do, and that is that show that this growth can happen much more quickly than they think. And by the time they're finished, they're arguing about, is it startups or scale-ups, or is it innovation, or is it technology, or should we incentivize it? By the time they're having those arguments, you're actually having those companies growing. And now the other part of that is communicating the growth. And I said this before, but I'll say it again because people have asked me about it. It's not a natural act for you, Quando, to talk about your growth. It's not a natural act for you if you expanded your office by 100%. It's not natural for you to tell your friends about it and say, guess what? And it's not natural for your friends to say, hey, that's a sign that you're growing. People have to learn how to do that. It's not rocket science, but they have to learn how to do that. And they can learn how to do it systematically. But again, only if you're single-mindedly focused on one thing. If you try to do everything, it falls apart. The coalition falls apart. The leaders, they try to join their hands together like my slide, and they can never quite reach. So, obviously, I'm a professor. I can talk for hours about this, but... Oh. No, you need it for the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Black from the Dynamic Business Startup Project based here in South Africa. I'm very interested in your whole measuring process. And one thing that is of particular interest to me is business failure, having tasted failure myself on a couple of occasions. So have you been able to correlate or to measure the amount of failure in general in the entrepreneurial sphere in Russia, and then when you put them on the accelerated growth program, how does that affect the failure rate? In other words, it's like stretching a rubber band. If you stretch it too far and too fast and too quickly, it could quite easily snap. So have you found that to be the case in terms of the scale-up?
Well, obviously we work with scale-up companies that are 2 to 5 years in business. So they've already gone through this startup process. So we've sort of weeded out the ones that have already failed. Businesses fail in Russia at an extremely high percentage, just like they do around the world. Our center has never really worked with startups, beyond potentially offering, being the GW host, which sort of celebrates startup. But that's not really a program, per se, with methodology. It's sort of a celebration of entrepreneurship. We've always worked with, for over the past 15 years, we've always worked with growth businesses because, in Russia, there are hundreds and thousands of programs targeting startups. There's resources, there's government attention, there's everything. Skolkovo, everything is targeted to startups. And, 5 years ago when we started working with these cities, and talking to them, what types of things would be good, what would you like and stuff. And we were doing surveys of the, gaps in the ecosystem. They also had a whole bunch of programs, and they conducted them themselves for startups. And having, learning about the Scale Up Accelerator really led us to understand that there's a niche to be filled. These people, these entrepreneurs who, are swaddled and coddled, their first couple of years, and they may fail, you're right. But once they get through those programs and they sort of went through the valley of death and they're sort of, hey, I've got a viable business here, there's nothing for them in Russia. I mean, there's absolutely nothing, no programs for them. And so that's one reason, a big reason why we decided to do the Scale Accelerator, because we're filling a niche in these cities that no one is providing. And so, an answer, I know it's not a very good answer to your question, but startups, fail all over in the same percentage. And, you can focus on them and focus on why or whatever, and many other organizations are. We've made a conscious decision to, work with those who have already gone through all those issues and maybe don't have the content, or the knowledge and contacts to get to another level of growth.
So there are a lot of different layers in those questions. And I won't address them all. But first of all, it's extraordinarily difficult to measure business failure because the ability and the speed at which you can close a company and it becomes a failure varies dramatically from regulatory framework to regulatory framework. And there are lots of reasons for that. The one thing I tell people is don't use survival or failure as measures of anything because they're highly influenced by laws and they can be changed just by tweaking the laws. I do want to say a couple of words about failure in the broader sense. First of all, it happens. Failure is it's a fact of life. It's very important at the regulatory side to make failure easy, from a structurally easy. In other words, it's very important of course, it takes time. Good bankruptcy laws, labor flexibility laws, unemployment training and insurance as opposed to protection of jobs. And we know this, that there's 4 or 5 regulatory aspects that make it structurally easy to fail. That's extremely important. On the other hand, there's a lot of talk about entrepreneurs wanting to embrace failure. And there's a difference between making a mistake and failing, which we don't usually make that distinction. Anybody who doesn't want to make mistakes don't wake up in the morning. That's just part of life, making mistakes and having a tolerance for mistakes. But the successful entrepreneurs, and some of them are very visible these days in the news in negative ways, such as Travis Kalanick and so on, failure is anathema to them. They hate to fail. The last thing in the world that good entrepreneurs want to do is fail, which doesn't contradict that society has to make it easy to fail. Regulation has to make it easy to fail. In order to be an entrepreneur, to be a scale-up entrepreneur, to grow a company, regardless of the age. And by the way, I happen to believe, because I've seen it, that the age of the entrepreneur and the age of the company doesn't make any difference whatsoever. I didn't show you the slide of Apple Corporation. Apple. If you look at the curve of the profits and market value of Apple Corporation, all of the value of Apple was created after 2007. All of it after it was 25 years old. 81. All of it. 25. And Jobs had been out for 12 years until he came back, and so on and so forth. So I think it's not the age of the asset that matters. The age of the, and we are age agnostic in our Scalerator programs, and we preach being age agnostic and not discriminating against older companies because we think that they may have failed. That's like discriminating against bad ideas. Who are we to know what the ideas are going to be good or not good? We don't know that. It's the value that you infuse in the asset that makes the difference. Entrepreneurs are infusing value into assets Old assets, young assets, new assets, old buildings, new buildings. They're building new ones, they're refurbishing old ones. It's the value that you infuse, it's not the age of the asset. So, more questions and comments. We have 5-10 more minutes. And I realize these may be arguable points. These are points that very, very smart people, exclude me from that list, argue about and have professional disagreements about. It's okay.
Thank you. I'm Toby Chance. I'm a South African Member of Parliament and what we call
Great that you're here.
Yeah, the Shadow Minister of Small Business Development in the South African Parliament. In other words, I'm the main opposition spokesman for small business. I have two questions. The first is the seeming contradiction between what you're talking about in terms of scale-ups and the TEA rate.
Yes.
I'd like your comments on that, because the former seems to be what you're going on about.
TEA is total entrepreneurial activity as measured by the global entrepreneurship model.
Right, and is the TE rate actually misleading as a measure of entrepreneurial health? The second question.
Well, can we just take one and then come back? Okay?
Okay.
Let's take one and make sure we get discussion. So, my opinion is that the TEA rate is misleading. It's not an indication of anything. If you look at the correlation that the World Economic Forum did recently with TEA, and usually that's a reflection of how many new companies or young companies there are. And I can show this, I have the data, I just didn't show it. But if you look at the competitiveness of countries and their total entrepreneurial activity, it's a perfectly negative correlation. Highly competitive companies have very, very low TEA rates. As you become less and less and less and less competitive, your TEA rates go down. And I'll give you an anecdote from Denmark, because Denmark I've done a lot of work there, and it's really fascinating because they have a culture at the policy level, a culture of experimenting. So the government bureaucrats actually are given, in my view anyway, a lot of leeway in experimenting and trying new things. And one of the things that they experimented with was a coaching program where somebody who went to register a new business, that triggered a flag in the government, and then volunteers would offer to go and give them information about what they have to do as a business owner. Denmark has a pretty high startup rate. It has an extraordinary low scale-up rate. We have the data and everything. They found that when experts sat with people wanting to start companies and told them that you'll have to fill out VAT, and you have to get insurance, and you'll have to make reports, that the number of startups went down. A lot of people said, this isn't for me. That's just anecdotal. But I actually think that in most societies, just in raw numbers, we have too many new firms being registered. Too many. By the way, one of the reasons that that's bad is that it takes talent out of the labor pool. So if you go to places such as Israel now, or you go to Silicon Valley, if you're a growing company, it's extraordinarily difficult to hire people because they're busy starting companies. And by the way, people have calculated this. The net present value of registering a new firm is negative. I'm sorry, I'm here at the GEC, I'm saying these things. I could be hanged. But these are the facts, these are the data. And there's also logic behind it. Now, I'll also reiterate something, is that the biggest line in my expense, it's not an expense, it's a cash outlay. The biggest line month by month by month is my investments in startups. So I love startups as an investor. I think I've learned how to do it pretty well. But that's very different from saying that somehow getting more and more people to register companies is going to stimulate the economy. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever for that. I'm sorry to say. And we can talk about, yes, startups create jobs and so on. I've looked at the raw data, and there are very strong, compelling alternative explanations for those data. So I apologize for saying those things, but I don't really apologize. do you get the second question?
Yeah, I buy your point about companies shouldn't be investing in small businesses per se. It's all about investing in competitiveness, which then raises the question, what are the incentives that should be put in place by government to help companies become more competitive?
But by the way, I want to say something about that entrepreneurship can flourish in very bad environments. I'm not saying that South Africa is a bad environment. I didn't say that. But if you're thinking in your mind, wow, we have lots of problems, we have power outages, and we have infrastructure problems, and high unemployment, and low education rates, and we have all these other problems of transparency, and we don't like our government, no one likes their government these days. Did I mention that I'm from the United States? But entrepreneurship can flourish. It doesn't become systemic, but it can flourish. And Israel's a great example. When entrepreneurship really started to blossom in Israel, it was a terrible, on all the measures, it was a terrible place. Capitalism was looked down upon. Personal wealth was looked down upon. The labor unions owned large parts of the economy. The government owned large parts of the economy. The legal encouragement of foreign investment wasn't there. There were negative incentives. So I think, first of all, it's very important for governments to invest in innovation, education, and other kinds of basics. But I think it's a big mistake to discriminate in favor of small or young firms. And it backfires. And I'll just give you an example of how it, and I know, again, I heard the speaker speak today. We want to encourage, first of all, growth is its own incentive. So if companies are growing, you don't say, here, take some money to grow. What you can do, of course, and what you should do as government, is make it easier for them to grow with soft incentives, with infrastructure and education and a better labor pool and better regulation, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to pay people to do things that are natural for them. Entrepreneurship is a natural act. Throughout society, throughout history, it's been there. It's part of being a human being. But if you look, for example, at France, in France, they passed a law quite some years ago to encourage small business by making it easy, reducing regulation, increasing the incentives, as long as you had fewer than 50 people. By the way, a lot of countries have this. Brazil, it's 10 people. It's called Simplèche, 9 people and below. You have a whole different administrative framework. In France, it's 50. And if you look at the number of companies that you have in France of different sizes, different numbers of employees, it's a beautiful curve. You have lots of one person, lots of two person, lots of three, and so on and so forth. You get to 49 people, guess what happens? You have lots of 49 people companies. And you have very few 50-person companies. Why? Because they get to 49, they say, I don't want to grow anymore. In Brazil, there are huge numbers of 9-person companies that the last thing they want to do is grow, because at that time they open the door and this maelstrom of administrative bureaucracy hits them in the face. That's what you should be solving.
Dan, could I add something into? I won't, yeah, just one word. I agree, build quality of life. Not just in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. Build quality of life in Tomsk, in Chumyan. Make it so that people want to live there. People want dynamic, interesting areas to live. They want good infrastructure. They want good, ability to do business, and the desire to stay in place.
That's really important, by the way, because if you look at Boulder, Colorado, the so-called
That's where I'm from. Yeah.
And in those days, in the 70s, 80s, Israel as well, people wanted to stay home.
Yes. And in Russia, everyone wants to go to Moscow.
And so making your home, wherever that is, a good place to live, that's not just the job of government, but it really has an impact on the ecosystem.
Instead of another competition for startups nationwide, like Russia's got 150 of them. I mean, put that money into making where they live right now a great place to live.